We know this truth that God is all there is, that the infinite intelligence of the universe created all of us in its likeness. During this Christmas season, we take that to heart because of the kindness that is generated from the songs, from the readings, from the scriptures, from the stories, the kindness that is generated throughout our community. It brings out the best of us. So this morning, as this lesson proceeds, we have a higher recognition of the importance of Jesus and the importance of his true teachings. We relax in the knowing that the story is beautiful, the wisdom is awesome, and this person we call Jesus was an authentic representation of God, just as we are. So I give great thanks for our teaching and for coming together this morning to question more about the great awakening of this man we call Jesus. So I let this lesson unfold with grace and ease and lots of joy, and so it is. So here I am. This has been really fun this week, and I'm not going to read all these books. I'm just going to use them for props, so don't worry. But during that little guided meditation, I hope you reached that place where you remembered when you first experienced your own divinity. I had been coming to this church for probably 6 months is all. And I was eating granola at my kitchen table one morning. And all of a sudden, my eyes were up in the corner of my kitchen looking back at me. And what we have heard is that that level of spirit vibrates at a much higher level. So I was vibrating at this level. The spoon was just coming up to my mouth because we vibrate at a lower level than spirit. And I watched myself, and to this day I can tell you the color of the tablecloth, the what I was wearing, the wallpaper on the wall. It was that dramatic. But my reaction to it after that was, I'll be darned. That was interesting. Nothing to get too excited about, but it was piercing what Reverend James used to call the veil, that simple veil between here and there. So I thought that was a good remembrance for me. But this morning, I especially want to thank Bob Rock. Bob has been on the West Star Institute. He's an associate of that West Star that had the Jesus Seminary, and he's been writing all these essays about Q and Thomas and Nag Hammadi texts. And, thanks to him, I've read more books about Jesus in the Bible in the last 3 months than I have my whole life. And I was raised Catholic. And, he got me so excited about it, I couldn't put them down, and here they are. And it was just an amazing thing because each one of these books, from researchers who are experts in their field and translators, it shows a new life, a new persona of this person that we call Jesus. Now, the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered in 1945 near that town in Upper Egypt. And I thought, some people say, oh, they're the works of the devil, but there were 1,200 pages of papyrus that was found. Now, that's a lot. 1,200 pages. And in that 1,200 pages, as they translated it, they found 52 different texts. So I'm quite impressed. And some of these were the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Secret Book of John, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Now, that's one I want to read, for sure. And they were translated between 1972 and 1984. So while Ernest Holmes was curious about the text from Nag Hammadi, they hadn't been translated when he was still alive, because he died in 1960. The one that's probably most popular, has been talked about the most, is called the Gospel of Thomas. And this book, Beyond Belief, which tells you her thought about this Gospel of Thomas, it's the title, Beyond Belief, The Secret Gospel of Thomas, Elaine Pagels. She's a Harvard graduate, and she teaches religion at Princeton. And she recalls in this book, when she was doing research and her thesis or PhD research at Harvard, that she was shocked to find out that the professors that were teaching ancient religions had cabinet files full of copies of the Nag Hammadi text that were not translated. They were just sitting there. So she thought, oh, they're probably not going to be that interesting. They're probably going to be trivial. And so she became an expert translator. And as she translated these, she was shocked to find how powerful they were. And so this story is also her story of her new revelation, her great awakening about this person, Jesus. Her book is focused on the 2nd century to the 4th century, where the people at that time, the Christian leaders at that time, rejected some gospels and accepted others. And she wanted to know why. Why would they reject some and accept others? Because we ended up with, as you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I always grew up thinking those were the only ones. No, there's a lot more. So why would they reject some and accept some? And that's the basis of this book. It's a wonderful read. It's a wonderful read. What she saw is that the Gospel of Thomas was unique, and so she compared it to the Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because they were the most dramatically different. And what she found is that this time of history, there was so much controversy, so much political intrigue, so much political upheaval, that John accepted some views and Thomas had other views. And so it was interesting what John liked and what Thomas liked. Now, Thomas, for instance, says, God's light shines not only in Jesus, but in everyone. That wasn't acceptable back then. Thomas encouraged people to seek to know God because of our own divine capacity, since all are created in the image of God. That wasn't acceptable back then. So the emphasis from Thomas was on each person's search for God, while John helped build a foundation for the church that was coming together. And for the foundation of the church, Jesus had to be Lord and God. And that was the emphasis of his gospel. But Thomas concluded that the divine light of Jesus is shared by everyone. But that wasn't acceptable at that time. Another example is when the disciples asked Jesus, when will the kingdom come? Because they were under horrible persecution and they wanted to be saved. In Thomas's book, Jesus said, it will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, there it is or here it is. Rather, the kingdom of God is spread throughout the earth and the people don't see it. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will see that it is you who are the children of the living Father. Pretty incredible at that time. But that if you do not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are the poverty. Oh boy, science of mine. So this morning, I'm not here to resolve any conflicts or say who's right and wrong. I'm just here to give you new flavors of what these discovered gospels are saying. And I find it incredibly intriguing. So that's Elaine Pagel's Beyond Belief. The next book that Luke turned me on to recently, and I think it's still on the New York Times bestseller, is Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, written by Reza Aslan. This is one I couldn't put down either. It's pretty amazing. He researched the New Testament for 2 decades, and then he researched the historical government documents of the time. And he compared them because the Gospels weren't relating some of the things that were happening at that time in the government and the oppression of the Jewish people. And he found that this person, Jesus, was very radical and very transformative, and it was a very tumultuous era in first century Palestine. In fact, it was important, and he finds it was a sacred duty of the Jews at that time to fight against Roman occupation. So history recorded that at that time there were scores of Jewish prophets, preachers, would-be messiahs, because everybody wanted to be saved from the oppression that they were feeling. So Reza describes the Jews in the first century wanting an apocalyptic experience. They wouldn't care if the whole world blew up. It was so oppressive. They longed for a Messiah. But it was so awful to say that there's a Messiah that whoever said that was subject to crucifixion, because crucifixion was a typical way of getting rid of people that were talking against the government. So Reza concludes, after all his 10 years of research of government and the New Testament, that there's really only two facts that we know for sure. That Jesus was a Jew who led a popular Jewish movement in Palestine in the first century. Fact. And there was a time when I didn't believe that. I'm glad to hear it's a fact. The second is that Rome crucified him for it. And that's a fact. So the history of the time is interesting to read because the disciples lived at a time when most people were illiterate and extremely poor. And the Roman occupation was very, very heavy-handed. And it wasn't until the year 66 that the Jewish temple, the Jews finally liberated themselves from the Holy Land. 66. One of the great events in Jesus' ministry was also found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it lends some insight into what a simple peasant might have been living in, like in Galilee. But what is it that was so threatening to the government? Well, one of the things that was very threatening, because Jesus was called a Messiah, even though he didn't call himself a Messiah, but when he did go into Jerusalem, he rode in on a donkey. Now, that was a prophecy from Zechariah. It said, "Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and victorious, humble and riding upon an ass." And for the illiterate people at that time, that prophecy was coming true. And so people saw Jesus as the king who was going to save them, who was going to free Israel from bondage. And then the next thing that happened was interesting. The next day, Jesus went into the temple, into the public area of the temple. In the book, Reza Aslan has a diagram of the temple and where people were allowed and where they weren't, where the sacrifices were, so it's all very well documented. So he went into the temple in the public area, and here are all the money changers, here are people selling souvenirs, and here are people selling animals for sacrifice. Because you could pay to buy an animal and have it sacrificed and have your sins all washed away. So it was very popular, and they did that 24 hours a day. So Reza says, can you imagine the pollution in the air, the smell of the air, the dust in the air? So he tries to take you right there. So Jesus goes in and he overturns the tables of the money changers. But the money changers were an important part of the temple because you could only use what's called a Hebrew shekel in the temple. You couldn't use any other funds. And they were the only place to get it, so it was quite a big business. Then they would charge you a half-cent tax for coming in the temple. So with the shekel, one could buy a pigeon, a goat, a deer, many things to then turn over to the operators of the temple to be sacrificed in the fires that ran 24 hours a day. So by doing that, he really threatened the temple leaders. I mean, that was just unheard of at that time. And so Aslan writes that Jesus' true crime was sedition, insurrection against authority, which was always punished by crucifixion. Now, where the historical records conflict with the New Testament, he seems to ask, in recorded history, why would the Bible contain things that were discrepancies against history? And his book ends with 63 pages of notations where he documents all this, 63 pages. This is an incredible work. And then he asks one final question. If there were so many people calling themselves messiahs, what made Jesus of Nazareth so important? And his conclusion was something extraordinary happened. I think that's what the West Star Jesus Seminary concluded too. I don't care what you say, something extraordinary happened. And what happened is Jesus' disciples all saw the risen Jesus after the crucifixion. And they all went to their deaths and would not recant that they saw the risen Jesus. That is what made him so special. That was the extraordinary thing that happened. On the last page of this book, I totally agree with the author. He says, Jesus of Nazareth was a man, but as bit as compelling, charismatic, and praiseworthy as Jesus the Christ. He is, in short, someone worth believing in. And I certainly agree with that. So that's Zealot. As you can tell, I've been reading a lot. The next book is called The Lost Gospel, and it's the Lost Gospel of Q, which in German means Quelle, which means it's a source document. Now, the Lost Gospel itself was never found on papyrus, but what Burton Mack did is he researched the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and said, where did they get some of their ideas, and where were they the same? Because they probably just didn't think them up, these sayings of Jesus. They probably got them from somewhere. So he went into great research to develop what he thought might have been a source document of the sayings of Jesus. Now, these are the sayings of Jesus as a teacher, not a Messiah, as a preacher, not a Messiah. And his first followers didn't want to found a church. He was just teaching them. And so they thought of him as a teacher, and he taught them ways to live during this very oppressive time. And one of the words he uses is Jesus made it possible for them to live with some verve, V-E-R-V-E. Looking that up on Wikipedia, it says enthusiasm. Wow, he enabled them to have some hope, to have some enthusiasm in those oppressive times. And so that's what he put together as the Gospel of Q, or the Book of Q. They weren't Christians, they weren't out to change the world, they were just out there to survive the oppression from the Romans. The interesting thing about this is, Jesus' teachings were pretty radical. And he says, he put into question the codes of the rituals that they had for purity. He put into question the hierarchical structure of the Jewish faith. It kind of makes me remember the 60s. That he would question the way things were going then. He would question it. And the 60s were very tumultuous, just like that. So I could relate on that level. Here are some of the writings that were developed from Q. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. That would work well back then, wouldn't it? If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer your other cheek. As you want people to treat you, do the same to them. Judge not, and you won't be judged. This was a good teacher. Ask, and it will be given to you. And the final one I wanted to share is don't worry about life. The birds and the lilies in the field. So there were a number of things that developed through this looking for a source that all of the Gospels used as a source of what Jesus really said. And a lot of it was about etiquette, how to live well in those times and not end up in conflict with the government. Authenticity, and how to feel like you do have God's care, you're in God's care. So what greater messages could he have brought to some people that were feeling so oppressed? So that's the Book of Q. This one is called The Hidden Power of the Bible, and it's by Ernest Holmes. Now, I avoided this book for years because I never read the Bible, and I thought, I probably wouldn't understand this. But after reading all these, it was like, this is a dynamite little book. In the preface by Jesse Jennings, who's one of the prolific writers in our field, he explains Holmes' interpretation of the Bible leads us inward rather than outward, and that's exactly what it does, and that's exactly what Jesus was teaching in those lost Gospels. He was curious about the Nag Hammadi texts, but nobody had translated them by the time he died. But he knew somewhere, if they were sealed and lost for that many thousands of years, there was probably some hope and some positive messages in there, some dreams for the people at the time. So he gathered together this philosophy, Holmes did, called Science of Mind, which he defines this way. A correlation of the laws of science, opinions of philosophy, and revelations of religion applied to the needs and the aspirations of humankind. It's a handbook on how to be a good person. Holmes always says in this book, okay, here's a few passages from the Bible. What could they mean that would give us a positive message for our life? And in the science of mind, he went for the positive. He studied the Bible, he studied the Vedas and the Holy Scriptures, but anything that was negative, that's unlike God, he eliminated and said, okay, now what have I got? What is the message that I now have? And that's how he developed the Science of Mind text, which is so life-affirming. And that's how the Fillmores developed Unity, if you know about Unity. A little more Bible-based, but very, very positive, very positive. So it's all about having a working tool for our lives that leads to greater awareness. And I was relating one of these stories to our Shoes for Souls and Food for Hope. In Matthew, it's written that when we give alms to the poor, we shouldn't sound a trumpet as the hypocrites do in the synagogues to get glory. Instead, when we give alms, let it be in secret, for the Father sees us and will reward us accordingly. And when we do Shoes for Souls and Food for Hope, we don't do it with any fanfare. You don't see our name anywhere. You don't see that it's a Center for Spiritual Living. And occasionally people ask. But we talk to them, we engage them, we lift them up, and when we leave, we feel lifted up. And that's what that means in Matthew. And that's what I hope this array of stories this morning do for you. You know, I love the Christmas story. I have nativity sets, 4 of them, and they're china, and they're this and they're that. But the one I always laugh at when I pull it out, it's a clamshell this big, and it's open, and a whole nativity set is in the clamshell. Got it in Mexico. Cutest thing ever. But I just love that because I love the story. I grew up with the story, and it's a heartwarming story. I don't have to believe it's true to get the benefit of it. It's just a really good story. In the preface of the latest edition of our Science of Mind text, Dr. Ken Gordon, our spiritual leader who came here several months ago, says, don't devour the book, digest it. That was words of wisdom. Because he's pulling together all these spiritual principles from many of the world's theologies. It's really a guide for your personal action, and I encourage you to think about that this holiday season. What he did is he removed what he saw was all the fear generated in some parts of the Holy Scriptures, and he kept the love. He kept the love. So I encourage you in the new year to please take a Science of Mind class. Come and feel that excitement, that awe-inspiring awakening, if you haven't had one already. And I'd like to end with my favorite other little book, Creative Thought Magazine. I have a question-answer column in it every month. I'm not going to read that, but I want to. It's always good. It's about Santa Claus this time. But I want to read what's on December 25th. Unto me a child is born. If I have enough light. Today, the universal Spirit of God is born again in me. The wonder and the joy that accompany this bear true witness that I am one with all good. On the blessed morning, my life is fresh and new. A little more light. Okay. Swaddled in infinite love, I experience heavenly peace. I love that. Doesn't that feel good? Attended by the angel of God's presence, I know that I am always safe and secure. My consciousness is giving birth to new ideas, new aspirations, and new plans. From the humblest of beginnings, these ideas are lifted up to greatness by the affirmative power of Spirit. Gazing at my world through the eyes of my inner child, I'm fascinated by this beauty, attuned to the knowing that I am, assured by the harmony of life. I always say yes. I follow my star to the sure fulfillment of my heart's desires. In this sacred moment, I give thanks to the source that creates me, watches over me, and prospers me. I release my word, and so it is. So you are swaddled in God's love, and so it is. Now, I'm going to put my other hat back on. Well, I hope it's as good as the music we just heard. Thank you. Inspired words. At the 9 o'clock service, I invited everyone at the guided meditation to think about that moment when you awaken to the truth of your nature, that you were created by the infinite intelligence of the universe. And I remember it very distinctly because I had been coming here for about 6 months, and I was at home at breakfast eating granola in the kitchen. And all of a sudden, I was up in the corner of the kitchen looking back at myself. Now, our understanding is that spirit vibrates at a higher level, and so when I was looking back at myself, I was eating about at that speed. And I found that kind of odd, but then Dr. James had said, you know, when we pierce the veil, it's very sweet, but it feels very mysterious, and yet it is an awakening that it isn't just this life that we're in a greater experience. So when I think about that moment of awakening for me, I can see the color of the tablecloth, the wallpaper, everything in my kitchen, and I continue to be in awe about that moment. The title of the talk this morning is The Great Awakening, and so I wanted to invite you this week especially to think about when you finally realized how precious this human life is and what this is all about. Now, Bob Rock is one of our members, and he was part of Silas Lyon's editorial again this morning, and he's been calling Silas about, do you really have to report all the crime in the community? I mean, can we have a little bit of upliftment here? But Bob he's part of the West Star Institute, where they have the Jesus Seminary, and he keeps telling me about these books that I should read, and I've been reading them. And I've read more about the Bible and God than I've read in my whole lifetime, just in the last 3 months, because of Bob. He wants us to know these things. And so during the Christmas season, I thought I would share with you some of these books, and I'm not going to read them all to you. But Bob hooked me on these, and I got hooked on them, and I thought, I got to spread the word. Part of the Great Awakening that I see happening throughout the world is happening based on a big discovery in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, which is an area in Upper Egypt, and some farmers were digging around in their fields, and they came across these sealed jars, clay jars. Now, I thought, okay, I've heard a couple of the Gospels from Nag Hammadi, and I thought, yeah, a couple pieces of papyrus in a jar. But I've really been studying this, and there were 1,200 pages of papyrus in those jars. And when they started translating them all, they found there were 52 different units of writings in those jars. One of them is called the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Book of John, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. That's the next one on my list. But these texts were finally translated and published between 1972 and 1984. One of the most popular books about this is a book called Beyond Belief, Elaine Pagels. Great picture, great book. She is a researcher. She studied at Harvard. She's now the professor of religion at Princeton. And she recalls in this book when she was at Harvard and doing all the research and the papers they do, to find out that the Harvard professors that were teaching ancient Christianity had file cabinets full of untranslated Nag Hammadi texts. They were just sitting there. So she herself became an expert translator in those languages. And she said, I thought it would just, be trivial and kind of garbled information. And she was shocked. She was shocked that it was full of unexpected spiritual power. For someone who does nothing but study religions, this was quite a shock to her. And many of these contain what appear to be the earliest sayings of Jesus. Not Jesus building the church, but Jesus, the teacher, of the people at that time. So this book is how, through the 2nd century to the 4th century, she wanted to study who decided what went into the New Testament and what didn't. What did people accept and what did they not accept? And so that's the focus of this book. Who restricted the writings that went into the New Testament? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 Gospels. Well, now we know there are more. Now, some people will say this is the work of the devil. Some people will say that's impossible because what it is, it is. I'm not here to judge right or wrong. I'm just here to give you information that I find is a renewed awakening in my mind and in my soul about this person that we've always honored as Jesus. The more she translated, the more she realized the depth of the political upheaval at that time. It was intense. In comparing the Gospel of Thomas from Nag Hammadi to the Gospel of John, she recognized that John was apparently written in the heat of controversy, and he was trying to push certain views and not other views. And it's interesting what John opposed, the Gospel of Thomas included and liked. Thomas says, God's light shines not only in Jesus, but in everyone. Woo. That was not acceptable at that time. Thomas encouraged people to seek to know God through our own divine capacity, since we're all created in the image of God. That didn't go over too well either. Now, Elaine's thought of why Thomas wasn't included in the New Testament is that in Thomas, he was encouraged people to search in their own heart and their own soul, not to search outside of them for their connection with God. So while Thomas concluded that the divine light of Jesus embodied is shared by all of us, it wasn't acceptable at the time. Another example is when the disciples asked, because it was a very, very difficult time. They were under great oppression from the Romans. They were looking for a savior. And Thomas, as Jesus said, well, when the disciples said, when will the kingdom come? He said, it will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying it is here or it is there. The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth and people don't see it. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. So when you come to know yourself, then you will be known and you will see that it is you who are the children of the living Father. Tough one for some at that time. And if you do not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty. And it is you that is the poverty, not knowing. So like I said, I'm not here to say right, wrong, and different. I'm just here that there are a whole rash of books from the Nag Hammadi text that shine a new light on that time in history. Another book that I could not put down, thanks to Luke, he said, you got to read this book, and I started, and it was like, I can't put this book down. Paul said, what do you do? I can't put this book down. It's called Zealot, and it's been on the New York Times bestseller list, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth by Reza Aslan, another researcher. For 10 years, he researched the New Testament and compared it to historical documents of what was going on in the history of life in Palestine at that time. And he was confused. The Bible said this, but the historical documents said this, and why would they be different? What he concluded from this study is that there was this person, Jesus, and he was radical, and he was transformative in the tumultuous environment of first century Palestine. It was a time of fervent nationalism, and it was the sacred duty of all Jews to resist Roman occupation. That's a real radical time. And history reports that there were many prophets, many people calling themselves messiahs who wandered through the land at that time. But at the first century of Palestine, everyone had this apocalyptic expectation, like the world was going to come to an end and they would be saved. And they were searching for this Messiah. In fact, what he found in historical documents is if you said there is the Messiah, you were subject to crucifixion, which was the typical way of handling any insurrection at the time. So Reyes said, after 10 years of research, here's 2 facts that I know. Be a little disappointing, 10 years and only 2 facts. Here's the 2 facts. Jesus was a Jew who led a popular Jewish movement in Palestine in the 1st century. Second fact, Rome crucified him for it. Now, growing up Catholic, we were always never encouraged to read the Bible. If you had a question, to ask the priest. But there were many times in my life that I doubt this person, Jesus, actually existed. Now to have these documents discovered thousands of years later that state what Jesus said is very refreshing to me. And I have a lot warmer feeling about this, especially after reading these books. So they lived in a time of heavy-handedness by the Roman occupation, and they were really praying for liberation from all this. So what did this man from Galilee do that was so important? He was just one of many talking and teaching to the people. Well, around earlier, Zechariah had made a prophecy that the king would be coming in riding upon an ass, and he would be humble and he would be righteous. And this is one of the reasons the people saw Jesus as a savior, king of the Jews, came into Israel on this riding an ass. And then the next day he went to the temple and, as you probably already know, turned over the tables of the money changers. Well, I thought, okay. But when you put it in historical perspective, the temple, which he outlines here in diagrams to show where people were allowed and where they weren't, where the sacrifices were held, all based on research, that in the temple, they would only take one form of money, the Hebrew shekel. So everybody else who came from far and wide had to exchange their money in order to buy stuff in the temple. And in the temple, you could buy animals for sacrifice, and that would wipe away your sins. And so people were coming in constantly, changing their money, buying souvenirs, buying pigs, buying pigeons, buying all kinds of goats and animals to sacrifice. And he says, can you imagine these fires for sacrifices were burning 24 hours a day. Can you imagine what that smelled like? Blood everywhere, killing all these animals, the air pollution. You know, he's really getting into the historical part of it. And then when you came into the temple, you had to pay a 50-cent temple tax, so you had to change your money for that too. So this is what was going on. When Jesus overturned the tables, that was really an intimidation for the temple leaders, a real intimidation. And they felt very, very threatened. And in the end, he writes that Jesus' true crime was just insurrection against authority. And I can see that when you put all those pieces together, it makes a lot of sense. So this book also goes over where historical records conflict with the New Testament. Why would the Bible appear to have things in it that historically never showed up? Well, he goes through all the discrepancies and tries to explain them based on what some people were doing, trying to build a church, trying to build a religion. So now you can see it and put it in perspective. The end of this book has 63 pages of notations between history and all. I mean, it's just phenomenal. I have not read those 63 pages. You are more than welcome to do so. I'm sure they're very, very interesting. But he asks one final question, and he says, if there was a multitude of messiahs and there are a multitude of people around that time, why is Jesus of Nazareth so darn important? And his conclusion was that something extraordinary happened. And I remember James telling me about the Jesus Seminary, and they had the black balls and the white balls, and did Jesus say this or that? And they had all these confusions and all this controversy. But in the end, every one of the people in the Jesus Seminary said, something extraordinary happened. So what this author finds throughout history is the extraordinary thing is all the disciples saw the risen Jesus after the crucifixion. And not one of them would recant their story, even undergoing gruesome deaths. That was extraordinary. It just gives me chills. At the end of the book, the author says, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the man, is as every bit compelling, charismatic, and praiseworthy as Jesus the Christ. He is someone worth believing in, and I have to say I agree. Because you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the 60s. I mean, weren't we just pushing the envelope in the 60s? This is what he was doing in first century Palestine. So I kind of got this flashback to the 60s. And I thought, we didn't know where that was going to end up either, did we? Just kind of an interesting thing. Okay, so that's that. Sell it. This is called The Lost Gospel, and it's about Q, the book of Q. It was never a book that was found. That's why it's a fascinating book, a whole book about something that was never found. But the author is Burton Mack, and he did a lot of research on that. And he said, I studied the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I'm finding things that they're kind of saying the same, and they're not saying the same, and then I find other threads of these sayings that Jesus said, and I concluded that they all had a source book, like I do for a talk. I have plenty of source books. And he said, I want to know what that source book probably said. So he went through extravagant studies and reconstructed a source document that he feels supports Matthew and Luke especially. It was the historical Jesus before the advent of official Christianity. And the sayings of Q, he thinks are the ones that his first followers said, because they weren't trying to create anything. They were just listening to him and his wise words. And Burton Mack sees that his followers, listening to the words of Jesus, finally found hope in their situation, finally found an enthusiasm to go on living every day. And that's what he thinks these initial sayings were. He said the book of Q, those early people were not Christians, and they had no intention of creating a church. But it was attractive for them, and it got them to experiment a little bit with social norms of the time, the 60s. The Jewish hierarchical social structure of the time, the 60s. Anyway, it just kind of, I got a kick out of that. Here are some of the things he found as he extrapolated what he learned and is calling it the book of Q. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Wouldn't that serve them well in first century Palestine? If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer your other cheek as well. As you want people to treat you, do the same to them. Judge not, and you won't be judged. Ask, and it will be given to you. Don't worry about your life. I mean, don't we find that everywhere in the Bible? Trust as the birds and the flowers. Trust. So these themes in Q, I think, were very helpful for people in learning etiquette on how to live in those tumultuous times. What to do when you did something in public and soldiers surrounded you. How to be authentic. How to not retaliate against some of the things that happen. Very good book. Interesting approach, and very worth studying if you're into this at all. Thank you, Bob Rock. So the last book is one I've avoided for years. It's because it was written by Ernest Holmes, our founder. And it's called The Hidden Power of the Bible. It was like, not going there, thank you. But it's so perfect with what I've been studying these past few months. Jesse Jennings is one of our prolific writers who did the preface here. And he explains that what Holmes does is he takes sections of the Bible, and then he says, how can we use that to improve our inner life versus outer life? How can we use what that said and improve our connection with God? Now, Holmes deeply was interested in the Bible, but he was also interested in all the other sacred scriptures that were available at his time. And he was interested in the Nag Hammadi texts, but none of them were transcribed before he died in 1960. But what he saw in the Bible was a common thread of hope and dreams for the people of Palestine, hope and dreams. And he defined science of mind as he compiled this for Hope and Dreams as a correlation of the laws of science, opinions of philosophy, and revelations of religion applied to the needs and aspiration of humankind. That's what we study. And it's so powerful. So what does the Bible mean to us personally? Well, only you and I can figure that out. But Holmes gives us a lot of indicators in this book. It's really a tool for our greater awareness, for our greater capacity to understand how precious this human life is. For an example, in Matthew, it's written that when we give alms to the poor, we shouldn't sound a trumpet like they do in the hypocrites of the synagogue. Instead, we should just let it be in secret. You know, when we give shoes for souls and food for hope, third Monday of the month for the homeless, that's what we do. We don't have a big sign saying, hey, look at us, look at what we're doing. We just present it. The homeless people come, we chat with them, talk with them, laugh with them, and we just see them as just people that we can help at this moment. And when we leave, we feel very enriched, just because we've done it secretly, silently, as it was said in the Bible. Now, I love the Christmas story. I'm sure you do too. You know, I grew up Catholic, and one of my favorite games with my girlfriends was playing nuns. And I mentioned that before, you know, because around Christmas it's really good to be very spiritual when you're Catholic. But I would go over to my girlfriend's house, and my mother and her mother would sit in the kitchen, and we'd be in the living room, and we'd get out some blankets, and we'd put them over our head with big bobby pins, and we'd go into the bedroom, and we'd kneel down by the bed, pray. Then we'd come back out in the living room and pick a ruler up and slap each other around. And our mothers would just watch us. That was our reality at Catholic school. That was our reality. Lots of stories about that. But I do love the Christmas story. And I have a lot of nativity sets at home because I love that idea of Jesus, Mary, and the baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the wise men. And so I've been starting to collect them. Don't buy me any, please. Paul would have a fit. But the one I love the most is a little clamshell about this big, and it's open about halfway, and the whole nativity set's right inside. Cute as can be. I got it in Mexico. But it just brings joy to my heart when I think of the Christmas story. So I'm hoping this discussion of what has been revealed in the Nag Hammadi text, whether they're right or wrong or real or not, but it's given us a new awareness of who this person Jesus was, the times that they were in, and why things happened that they happened. But it also instills in me a greater appreciation for his feistiness, his zealousness, his determination to help people and to help them be better, even in oppressive times. Our Science of Mind text, the newest edition, at the end, or I guess it was the beginning, our spiritual leader, Ken Gordon, wrote that our book of Science of Mind deserves to be digested, not devoured. And if any of you have tried to read it on your own, you know that's true. You're not going to devour this book in 3 hours. But it deserves to be recognized as a way of bringing spiritual principles home into our heart. The one thing that Ken Gordon said about Holmes when he read the Bible and all these texts, he took out everything that was fear-based and left love. And that's what it is. You know, just that simple awareness. Get rid of the fear. Fear's not going to get you anywhere. Settle in the love. So he calls the Science of Mind an operating manual for us. And that's really what it is. So in the new year, I invite every one of you to come to classes because this will stir your soul. I see it often. I see it a lot in people that really delve into this. So if you're interested in the books that I mentioned, I've typed them up on a little piece of paper. They're on the question-answer table back there on this little slip of paper if you can get them. But I encourage you to go deeper with the Christmas story, with the life of Jesus, with the people who survived Palestine, and the people who went on to build a church, whatever you think about that church or all the things that happened. But I believe, like Emma Curtis Hopkins, it was always done with good intention, no matter how it came out. So join me in this great awakening to this awareness of divinity all around us. There truly is only one infinite intelligence that has created all. And this intelligence has created each one of us. Our beautiful souls in this life experience, this juicy human life experience. Learning to be better people. Learning to honor everything around us. Learning to live together in harmony and peace. It's the simple message of Christmas. We're all in this together. So as we go forth from here today, I feel in my heart for you a level of peace that is deeper than before. And an honoring of this persona, this Christ consciousness in Jesus that can be enlightened in each one of us. And for this, I am so thankful. And so it is. Mm-hmm.